Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Patryk Witkowski and I'm joined today by former SNP MSP Maureen Watt. Hello.
Good evening, Patrick. How are you doing?
Very well. It's nice to see you again. Uh,
Yeah, and
for our
you.
f- Thank you. For our first story, we've got the Ukraine update, day 845 of a conflict. More than 80 countries and international organizations have endorsed Ukraine's territorial integrity in the face of Russia's invasion in a joint communique issued at the end of a peace conference in Switzerland. The final statement of the summit in Bergenstock said the UN Charter, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of all states, can and will serve as a basis in achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. It called for Ukraine's control over Zaporizhia nuclear plant and its Azov seaports to be restored. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told the closing news conference that Russia and their leadership are not ready for a just peace, while welcoming the first steps towards peace, and Russia can start negotiations with us even tomorrow without waiting for anything if they leave our legal territories, he said. The final document also called for all prisoners of war to be released in a complete exchange, and for all Ukrainian children who have been deported and unlawfully misplaced to be returned to Ukraine. Working groups of the summit also addressed the issue of global food security and nuclear safety. Despite the agreement, Western powers and their allies failed to persuade major non-aligned states to join the final statement as India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Thailand, and the United Arab Emirates all withheld their signatures from the communique. Brazil attended as an observer and did not endorse the text. Russia was not invited and China declined to attend the event. After the summit, European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen called for patience and determination. She said it was not a peace negotiation because Putin is not serious about ending the war. He's insisting on capitulation. He's insisting on ceding Ukrainian territory, even territory that today is not yet occupied. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan dismissed a peace proposal presented by Putin as unreasonable, saying meeting Moscow's demands would make Kiev even more vulnerable to further aggression. Sullivan said of a peace summit that under the Moscow proposal, not only does Ukraine have to give up the territory that Russia currently occupies, but Ukraine has to leave additional sovereign Ukraine territory. He noted that Kiev would also be bound to disarm under the Russian proposal, so that it is vulnerable to future Russian aggression down the road, he said. On Sunday, Russia claims its troops have captured the village of Zegrin in the Zaporozhye region in southern Ukraine, continuing its progress on the front line against the Ukrainian army lacking troops and ammunition. Earlier in the week, it claimed the capture of 3 villages in Ukraine's east, southeast, and northeast. The Russian army is suffering heavy losses in its Kharkiv offensive, a Russian soldier has claimed. Anton Andreev, the Russian soldier from the 5th Company of the 1009th Regiment, said his unit had been decimated and only 12 out of 100 soldiers still alive, as they came under constant Ukrainian fire and drones in Vovchansk, a prime target of Russia's advances. A Russian journalist, Nikita Tsitsagi, was killed in a drone attack in eastern Ukraine 2 days after the death of another correspondent near the front line. Maureen, as the Ukraine conflict develops, what are your thoughts and what do you think is left to do about it?
Well, I think Zelensky can be heartened by the result of the talks in Switzerland this weekend. Clearly, the West is united in their support, continuing support for Ukraine. And we heard at the end of last week Putin's demands that I think it was it 3 or 4 regions should be in Russian hands, and that was their opening bid. And clearly, the Ukrainians have come back to say that the Russians must leave Ukrainian territory completely. So there's clearly a big gap still in where they need to be for any meaningful peace talks. I think it is absolutely vital that Ukraine get their control of their seaports and their power stations. I mean, that would seem to me to be absolutely fundamental. I'm really pleased to hear that concern is expressed for all the Ukrainian children who have been taken away into Russia for nothing other than brainwashing. And, families do not know when they're going to get them back. And it is important and that we recognise the huge importance of Ukraine, which I'm sure most of us didn't before the outbreak of war, on the huge importance of the food supplies from Ukraine to global food security. So there are bases there on which hopefully peace can be built on, but I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow.
Thank you, Maureen. Moving on to our Israel and Gaza latest, where at least 37,347 have been killed and 85,372 injured in Gaza since October 7th, according to the Gaza Health Authority. Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the Israeli war cabinet that had been overseeing the conflict in Gaza, rebuffing far-right allies who have been seeking seats, and apparently moving to solidify his grasp on decision-making over the fighting with Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Prime Minister announced the move to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, announced the move to ministers, saying the war cabinet had been established as part of an agreement in which the moderate politician Benny Gantz and his National Unity Party joined an emergency coalition last year, and was no longer needed now that Gantz had left government. Disbanding of the war cabinet was confirmed by Israeli officials, briefing anonymously, against a backdrop of mounting discontent over the conduct of the war in Gaza and calls for anti-government groups for a week of daily protests. 2 highways were reportedly blocked in Israel by demonstrators on Monday morning, and a rally outside the Knesset is planned for Monday evening. U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein was in Israel for talks with Netanyahu, Gantz, Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, and opposition leader Yair Lapid. Lapid said on social media, instead of disbanding the war cabinet, the government should be disbanded. UNRWA chief Philip Lazzarini said the agency had not seen a change in the position on the ground since Israel's military announced it would take tactical pauses in its action to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza. He told the media, operationally, nothing has changed yet. For the time being, I see nothing which would qualify to the definition of a pause. Israeli spokesperson David Mencer said Israel had not seen any signs that Hamas would also pause fighting during the tactical pauses that Israel's military has said will take place during its ground defensive in Gaza. Palestinian news agency Wafa reports that one person had been detained by Israeli security forces at a military checkpoint in Jenin camp in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. The Committee to Protect Journalists has recorded so far that at least 108 journalists and media workers have been killed during the Israeli-Hamas conflict since the 7th of October. That figure includes 103 Palestinians, 2 Israeli, and 3 Lebanese media workers. Maureen, passing over to you, talk to me about your thoughts of what's happening in Israel and Gaza.
Well, I think my first question would be, is Netanyahu losing support among his own war cabinet, that so many are resigning, and he's sort of saying, well, it's not needed anymore? It sounds to me that I think he's losing support among elected politicians as well as vast tracts of the Israeli population. In terms of what's happening on the ground, the Israeli forces still seem to be concentrating on Gaza, and there's some, I couldn't quite understand some report I was reading or listening to where the Rafah crossing, which we know is the most important from Egypt, is not operating in any way, shape, or form properly, and the hundreds of, if not thousands, of trucks that are needed daily to sustain the population of Gaza in normal times are simply not getting through. And there's another crossing where there are also problems. So, I mean, this is starvation of the whole population of Gaza, and I really do hope that the powers that be, once this conflict is over, do bring Netanyahu to The Hague for all the war crimes that I'm sure he proved that he has committed in Gaza.
Thank you, Maureen. Shifting our focus to the UK, we've got our general election campaign coverage, starting with the Conservatives, where Prime Minister Rishi Sunak delivered a speech in Cambridgeshire earlier today, where he stated, "I know the last few years have been tough. I know people are frustrated, but we are making progress and we've turned a corner. Inflation is back to normal, economy is growing faster than our competitors, immigration is starting to come down, and more investment in our security, and the union is secured." Maureen, how do you think a statement like this resonates with the UK public? And what are your thoughts of the Conservative Party as a whole right now?
Well, I suppose one truth in there is that inflation has come down, but people, I'm sure, will not forget that the inflation was caused by the Conservative government itself, Liz Truss, and prior to that, through former prime ministers. So I don't think that it's going to wash that Rishi Sunak is the right person to be in charge of the economy going forward, because many people are saying, well, you know, you've crashed it and you've trashed it over so many years. Why on earth would we give you another term to try and fix it? And I think the depressing thing about the whole campaign between Tories and Labour is that they're really not offering people anything new. I mean, they're so frightened to upset the apple cart and get on the wrong side of the media that it, you know, as some people are saying, it's just really boring. And I do worry about the turnout in this election and how we're going to up to some meaningful level of turnout, because, you know, I can't remember which philosopher it was who said that the UK is free only once in every 5 years. And, you know, July the 4th is the one day that we're free to make that choice. And it's really important that people register their choice at the election.
Thank you, Maureen. Moving on to Reform, where Reform UK has published its manifesto today, calling it a contract with the British people. Amongst the plans is the abolishment of net zero, the loosening of inheritance tax, and raising the minimum tax threshold to £20,000, or £25,000 for one spouse per marriage. The IFS has called into question Reform UK's ability to raise its necessary funds, even if their plan to lower interest rates follows through. Now, you mentioned there a little bit of Maureen, the crashing of the economy under the Conservatives. How much do you think this sort of free market, small government approach to economics inspires hope in people after in like a post-Liz Truss kind of world?
I mean, I think there is a crisis where people, you get the impression that people expect Scandinavian-style public services with style low taxation, and the two just don't commute or compute. So there is a gap in in reality there, I think. But as far as Reform are concerned, I mean, they are not going to be a party of government, so they can say virtually anything they like. And I suppose it depends just how many people are taken in by Farage and ridiculous promises on the economy, which I think any fair-minded economist are, as you have pointed out, Patrick, say are absolutely not going to wash. I mean, one of the things that is clearly obvious in this election is that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are absolutely scared stiff that they say or do anything that will spook the financial markets. And it was the financial markets, remember, that were spooked totally and utterly by Liz Truss and her Under-Chancellor at the time. So it's, if Nigel Farage would be seen as being anywhere near the levers of power, I'm sure the financial markets would be the first to react.
Thanks, Maureen. And you mentioned labor there, which we will cover now, where the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS, has warned that 670,000 more children will be hit by the two-child benefit cap by the end of the next parliament. The policy, introduced by the Conservatives and which the Labour Party has not committed to abolishing. The SNP is calling for an emergency child poverty budget, stating that the Labour Party will push thousands of Scottish children into poverty. In contrast, the SNP is calling for Starmer to commit to an emergency child poverty budget. Also, the former Labour General Secretary, Jenny Formby, has said she is voting for the Greens, stating on X, "I'm voting Green. Not perfect, but much more transformative agenda. And people can't keep voting Labour just because we've got to get the Tories out." Maureen, with Labour just recently revealing their budget plans, do you believe that Labour is doing enough to keep their voters and to inspire people to vote for them?
I can see big problems ahead for Labour if and when they get in, which is looking pretty certain. And it will be compounded by the size of their majority. I mean, there was talk at the weekend in the media, press media in particular, about the polls showing that the Tories are going to crash to their lowest number of MPs, I think, since the First World War or something like that. And that means that Labour will have a huge majority. And because they have a huge majority, there is room, therefore, for dissent to emerge within the Labour Party. I think it's being sat upon at the moment very hard, and we saw that by the Keir Starmer's treatment of Diane Abbott. So I think the bigger the majority that Labour get, the more likely there is to be dissent within the Labour Party. And I think over the two-child clause and benefit is one area where we could see that dissent. I have to add that I'm really proud of the SNP sticking to their guns and keeping the pressure up on the two-child limit. I mean, Alison Thewlis MP has done a huge amount of work in keeping this to the fore in the House of Commons, along with many of our colleagues. Because John Swinney and the SNP government in Scotland have put child poverty at the top of their agenda, it could be really transformative if the two-child cap was lifted and more benefit was coming from London rather than have to be mitigated out of the Scottish budget. So I hope that the pressure from all sides is going to be kept on Keir Starmer about this, and that maybe we even change of heart during this election campaign. That would be some real progress to a more just society under Labour and some sort of difference from just being red Tories instead of blue Tories.
Thank you, Maureen. Moving over to the Liberal Democrats, who just recently announced their manifesto, which promised more NHS funding, the scrapping of a Rwanda scheme, and the two-child limit, alongside a recommitment to net zero. They also promised to, quote, fix the UK's broken relationship with Europe. And that includes a pledge to seek to rejoin the single market with a longer-term objective of rejoining the EU. Um, Now, Maureen, I guess could you? I was wondering, Maureen, where do the Liberal Democrats rank for you in terms amongst all the other parties, and what do you think of like some of these campaign pledges?
Well, we have to remember that in the current setup in Westminster and the number of MPs for each party, the Liberal Democrats are quite far behind the SNP at the moment. Now, I don't think that will be the same after the election, because I think a number of constituencies where in England, in parts of England where they're fed up of the Tories, they won't vote Labour, but they may vote Lib Dem as a softer option, I suppose. So I'm sure that they will be on track to pick up seats. There is little prediction of them picking up more seats in Scotland, apart from perhaps one. But so their ambitions are pretty low. And to be honest, with all Davies' tricks and photo ops, just making him look silly, they just seem to be a third slideshow, a third option, but not a very serious option. I mean, we're talking about Britain being in the worst crisis since outside, really, and this is all he can do. I maybe as a serious politician, I just can't be bothered with people who don't take the situation really seriously, and as I see it, really serious.
Thank you, Maureen. For the SNP, Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes has warned that the UK approach to immigration is the biggest challenge facing Scottish economic growth, saying that the success of Scotland's industries is reliant on migration, adding that as anti-migration rhetoric ramps up from the Conservatives and Labour, it will be up to the SNP to fight for Scottish economic growth. Now, there is something here, Maureen, where for Scotland and for England, there seems to be a different political mood around like refugees and migration. Do you think that is this something that do you agree that this is something that the SNP is uniquely positioned to argue for in a UK government or in UK Parliament?
So I think we've got to distinguish between refugees and economic migrants here.
Hmm.
Refugees are clearly fleeing for their lives because of falling out with their regimes, or just not seeing, or yeah, political refugees or whatever. Economic migrants are something different, and it's clearly, I think, the sympathy towards refugees, and we've seen that with Ukrainian refugees in Scotland. We've taken more than our share. But also in terms of the economic migrants, the birth rate in the UK, as well as the rest of the Western world, is falling dramatically. And in order to get economic growth, you have to have a fairly active population, and the populations in the UK are getting older, and it's more of a problem in Scotland than it is in the rest of England. So the increase in the working age population has got to come from somewhere. And this is not an SNP thing. It was something that Jack McConnell, when he was First Minister, talked about a lot. And Scotland was beginning to see a bigger increase in in economic activity, with more people coming and working in Scotland. So I think the argument about inward migration for economic reasons should be well established in Scotland if it's not in England, because you've got the very right-wing parties and politicians using them as a political weapon. And Scotland has got the potential to grow pretty quickly. I mean, we've seen just this weekend, can't remember who it was saying that and maintains its position as being the area of largest economic growth after London and the southeast of England. And we've seen in terms of inward investment that Scotland is the best after the southeast and the London and the southeast than anywhere else in the rest of England. So the potential for growth in Scotland is there, but we just don't have the people, as we can see quite clearly, in terms of food production and in hospitality. The people to make that work just simply aren't here.
Thank you. Speaking in Stornoway today, First Minister and SNP leader John Swinney said that the choice on July 4th is becoming clear, as the party prepares to publish the only left-of-centre manifesto on offer at this election. The First Minister said that the SNP manifesto will set out an end to Westminster austerity and an alternative to the billions of pounds in cuts planned by both Labour and the Tories. The SNP manifesto will include plans for investment in public services, protections for the NHS against the creeping privatisation agenda favoured by West Streeting, the reversal of a damaging failure of Brexit, and support for families struggling through the cost of living crisis. Now, Maureen, obviously you are a former SNP MSP. Which of these do you think are fundamental for, or the key pillar that the SNP needs to push to pull in as many voters as possible, if you were to pick one sort of policy to really push for the Scottish public?
Well, I think it's important to highlight the SNP's unique selling point, which is independence for Scotland. That's what makes the SNP completely different from all the other parties. We're not answerable to any masters in Westminster in terms of the manifesto. And the independence is not just for the sake of independence itself, but what you can do with independence. It's getting the rest levers which are retained at Westminster, all of them, so that you can run the economy using all the levers of power, because Scotland has a wealth of talent. It has some of its universities are in the top 50 in the world, much more than our per population it should be. We've got more graduates per head of population than other countries. And the natural resources, including our renewable energy, make Scotland a good place for people to invest in and to really grow the economy and make everybody wealthier by having decent wages, decent employment laws, all of the things that we don't control at the moment. And I think it really is important that the reasons why we want independence, and I've for over 50 years, are highlighted in this election, because we won't be able to fix the NHS by just tinkering around the edges. It does need fundamental investment, and these things, I think, can only come with all the levers of control on the economy, which we don't have in Scotland at present. I must say I am hugely impressed by John Swinney's energy and ability to get around the country. I mean, since Friday night, he's been in Munich, watching the football. He's been on a park run, presume a 5K park run in Munich on Saturday afternoon. By Sunday morning, he was texting me that he was on the farm that I was brought up in Keith, in
Wow.
Murrayshire. And today he's Western Isles, a seat which, obviously the local SNP were really worried about because they've got a fairly high profile Labour candidate. And of course, Angus Brendan McNeil is as an independent. So I think the runes are pretty good for retaining that seat for the SNP. But
Mhm.
I mean, he is certainly leading from the front.
And this is maybe a little bit of like a vague follow-up question, and you can let me know if you don't have a perfect answer for it. But do you feel like the SNP is pushing enough of that independence rhetoric, or are they maybe not mentioning it as much as you would like? How do you feel about it, considering that you see it as the main selling point of the SNP?
Well, I think everybody knows what the SNP stand, and I take that. It is important, though, to put, in my opinion, to put flesh on the bones of what independence means. That how it is a way of doing economics differently, for example, a way of doing social justice differently. Of course, you're going to get our detractors and our opponents saying we're all one on one side. We're always talking about independence. We never talk about anything else. And Alba, for example, saying that we don't talk about it enough. So if we're if we're getting flack from both sides, maybe we're doing all right in what's happening in the middle.
Thank you, Maureen. For our next story, we have teachers and GPs staggering under extra demands caused by poverty in the UK. New research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the JRF, has found schools and primary health services in the UK are staggering under the pressure of demand caused by an epidemic of extreme poverty, as desperate families unable to afford food, clothing, or heating increasingly turn to them for crisis help. Teachers and GPs in England, Scotland, and Wales are informally acting as emergency food providers, welfare advisors, and housing officers and social workers alongside their day jobs as they devote more and more time and resources to support struggling parents and children, according to the research. Staff routinely helped parents solve housing, visa, and benefits problems and provided them with food, clothes, and shower and washing machine facilities. They have also handed out cash for for energy meters, toys, and books. The They have routinely also handed out cash for energy meters, cash for toys, and books, the JRF study revealed. Poverty campaigners have warned that the two main parties' election manifesto promises to improve the NHS and schools would ring hollow unless they were prepared to also urgently tackle rising poverty if elected. Katie Schumacher, the JRF's principal policy advisor, said, "No plan for our schools or NHS should be taken seriously if it doesn't include tackling hardship. Primary schools and GP services are staggering under the weight of hardship, and it shouldn't fall to them to ensure families are not going hungry." The latest official figures show 4.3 million UK children, about 1 in 3, were in relative poverty in 2022 to 2023. More than 1 million youngsters experienced destitution, extreme material hardship, while charity food banks gave out record numbers of emergency food parcels last year. The JRF study, based on focus groups, interviews, and surveys, found primary school staff estimated 48% of their pupils and primary care staff, 57% of their patients, had experienced hardship at some point since the start of the school year or over the past 12 months. A third of schools and nearly half of GP surgeries had set up food banks to provide emergency food supplies to hungry pupils and families. Staff in schools in deprived areas estimated 44% of pupils have come to school hungry over the past year. Nearly a quarter of NHS primary care staff and 40% of teachers said they had dipped into their own pockets to help pupils and patients. In one case, a nurse gave new underpants still in their packet and intended for her husband to a desperate patient. GPs in schools, particularly in deprived areas, were now typically regarded by struggling families as a first line service that would deal with their problems, the JRF said, in part because other forms of community based advice and support, such as Sure Start, had been cut over the past 14 years. Maureen, what do you blame a lot of these problems on, and what are the solutions for it?
Well, clearly, it's poverty. It's a lack of financial resources in so many households. Um, and it'd be interesting to know exactly whether the study focused on England or whether it was throughout the UK, because in Scotland you know, we have we have to through looking at a whole
Yeah, this
life
was a UK-wide
and the
service,
best
sorry, just to clarify.
right and the best start in life through from the baby boxes to making sure that children in their early years have, I think, 11 different um, interactions with health visitors and things, and also in our health service, you making that each GP surgery has a person in there who looks after that sort of thing. The GPs and the nurses, stick to looking after the health of the patient, but often the health of the patient is due to poverty, a lack of food or decent clothing or decent housing, and there's a person in each surgery that can help with that aspect in directing to the right places. And it's little wonder that we're talking about health and education professions, because they are the caring professions, and you're not going to turn a blind eye to anything of this. But it is a desperate sign of uncaring governments, that you have schools having to provide clothing exchanges within the schools, and even washing machines. I mean, that is pretty bad. And I think, you know, governments should be ashamed of that. But at the same time, Scotland, in terms of the extra child payments that we're paying, is doing everything it can to try and lift people out of poverty. And, we have got lower rates of poverty in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK because of these actions that we're taking. And that's not really something that you should be writing home about. That should be something that a caring society in general shouldn't have. It's just awful.
Thank you, Maureen. For our next story, we have global spending on nuclear weapons going up by 13%. Global spending on nuclear weapons is estimated to have increased by 13% to a record $91.4 billion during 2023, according to calculations from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which is a pressure group. The new total, which is up $10.7 billion from the previous year, is driven largely by sharply increased defense budgets in the US at a time of wider geopolitical uncertainty caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war. All 9 of the world's nuclear-armed nations are spending more, ICANN added, with China judged to be the second largest spender with a budget of $11.9 billion. Though Beijing's total is well below the $51.5 billion attributed to the US. Russia is the third largest spender at $8.3 billion, followed by the UK with $8.1 and France at $6.1 billion. Although estimates for authoritarian states or the free countries with undeclared nuclear programs, India, Pakistan, and Israel, are all complicated by a lack of transparency. Susie Snyder, one of the authors of the research, warned that nuclear states are on course to be spending $100 billion a year on nuclear weapons, and argued that the money could be used on environmental and social programs instead. These billions could have been used for combating climate change and saving animals and plants to sustain life on Earth from extinction, not to mention improving health and education services around the world, Snyder said. Over the past 5 years, since ICANN began its research, nuclear weapons spending has soared by 34%, or $23.2 billion. Spending by the US increased by 45% during that time and by 43% in the UK, and on current trends will surpass $100 billion in 2024. Maureen, what do you think is the reason behind increasing this spending? What sort of reasons and excuses could some of these countries use, and do you think they hold any merit?
Well, the West has said that NATO countries should be spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. And clearly, some are having to up their spending. Most of them are having to up their spending to meet that. I just think it's a crazy, arbitrary number, percentage, and the West or NATO is not looking strategically at what exactly is needed where, and under whose control. Um, it's important here in election campaign to note that Keir Starmer for Labour has said that he will renew Trident, and I'm sure I heard him say introduce two more submarines. So we're not going to get any change of direction from Keir Starmer whatsoever. But contrary to the West, we're seeing Iran increase its nuclear capability, and whether we like it or not, the UK has got a huge defence industry, and I also read over the past few days that the vacancies in defence industries in the UK is huge at the moment, and companies are desperate for people to come and work in the defence industry. So clearly, the UK economy is benefiting this increase in defence spending. But it brings me back to my days of studying basic economics when there was the 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 argument was always guns or butter, and clearly I am someone who would think it would be better to spend the money on butter and feeding populations rather than killing them.
Thank you, Maureen. Ursula von der Leyen on track to remain EU Commission President. Ursula von der Leyen is on track to remain for a second term as President of the European Commission, as EU leaders meet today for a first discussion on divvying up the bloc's top jobs. The EU's 27 heads will gather for dinner in Brussels in their first group meeting since European elections last week boosted national and far-right parties and triggered Emmanuel Macron to call snap elections in France. At stake is whether von der Leyen receives a second 5-year term as head of a commission, which initiates and enforces EU law. EU leaders will also decide on successors to Michael, the president of the European Council, and to Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat. Von der Leyen has long been the clear frontrunner as the lead candidate for the centre-right European People's Party, which will be the largest group in the new European Parliament with 26% of the seats. Her position has been strengthened by the Europe-wide vote. Macron's election gamble, widely seen as a move that will distract the French president from European affairs, is also viewed as helping her cause. Macron had previously appeared to flirt with replacing von der Leyen with former Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi with diplomats, but diplomats are now expecting France to fall into line. First round of France's parliamentary elections is on 30th June, after an EU summit on the 27th to 28th June that is intended to finalize the EU's senior roles. The appointment process might be easier than it usually is, quote, said one EU diplomat. The thinking is that the French have so much chaos at home they might want to spend less time on this. Consensus is also firming around Portugal's socialist former Prime Minister Antonio Costa to take over from Michael in chairing EU Council meetings. The Danish Prime Minister met Frederiksen has been rumored to be an alternative choice, but diplomats say her hard-line stance on migration means she is not favored by her European socialist group. Estonia's Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, is a favorite to take over from Borrell as the EU's top chief diplomat. Malta's Roberta Metsola is expected to get another Roberta Metsola is expected to get another term as president of the European Parliament, although the decision falls to MEPs when they meet in mid-July. Once the Parliament has elected its speakers and filled other senior posts, MEPs will have the final say in confirming the next Commission president. In a vote penciled in for 18th July, von der Leyen or another appointee will have to win the votes of 361 of the 720 MEPs. Maureen, what do you make of the trajectory of the European Union? And do you think we'll have a shift on some of the policies and some of the expectations that they have of member states?
Well, I suppose we should breathe a bit of a sigh of relief that Ursula von der Leyen is going to be having a second term. On one level, I'm really pleased because at least when we see the G7 and other bodies like that, we'll have at least one woman there or two with the Prime Minister of Italy, but there's clearly a dearth of women in these summit meetings, and her experience will be badly needed, I think. We shouldn't forget that, the European Union, the European Parliament has been on the right of politics for a number of decades now. It's not the socialist grouping that many people would make it out to be. And I think von der Leyen will hopefully, with her experience, be able to deal with the huge influx of far-right politicians that the European Parliament elections last week threw up. And it'll be interesting to see whether I think is important, whether they're able to agree on stuff sufficiently to make any mark as far-right politicians. So we have so very little coverage of European matters in our mainstream media these days, which is absolute appalling, whether we're in Europe or outside it, just in international affairs. But it'll be interesting to see whether we get any more as a result of the changed composition of the European Parliament. Of course, not forgetting that Commission is different, but nevertheless, von der Leyen is someone who has to report to the European Parliament on a regular basis from the Commission.
Thank you, Maureen. And continuing on that note of informing Broadcasting Scotland viewers of international affairs, we've got the Sudan facing the world's deadliest famine in 40 years. Sudan is facing a famine that could become worse than any the world has seen since Ethiopia 40 years ago. U.S. officials have warned as aid deliveries continue to be blocked by the warring armies, but army supplies to both sides continue to flow in. With much of the world's attention focused on Gaza, the scene of another human made famine, Sudan, is already the worst humanitarian crisis in the world and is slipping towards a humanitarian disaster of historic proportions, with far less media coverage and global concern. A UN humanitarian appeal for the country has received only 16% of the funds it needs. We need the world to Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US ambassador of the UN, said the following to reporters: "We need the world to wake up to the catastrophe happening before our very eyes." She was speaking as El Fasher, the capital of the Darfur region and former humanitarian hub, faced its second month under siege by the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. The RSF is a paramilitary group that has been fighting the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, since April 2023. When a power struggle between two rival generals, the SAF's Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the country's de facto ruler, and the RSF's Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti, this escalated into a conflict that has split the country. The civil war has already killed 14,000 people and forced 10 million to flee their homes. The UN Security Council adopted a UK drafted resolution on Thursday, demanding an end to the El Fasher siege. But the fighting escalated on Friday, with the SAF claiming to have repelled a major RSF assault, inflicting huge losses. Head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Samantha Power, said there were concerns over what would happen to the people sheltering in El Fasher if the town fell to the RSF. That force has largely been recruited from the Janjaweed militias, who carried out massacres while fighting on the Khartoum's government's side in the Darfur genocide in 2003 to 2005. The RSF is on the march, and where RSF has gone in the Darfur area historically and in the conflict, mass atrocities have followed, Power said. On Friday, Ms. Power announced $315 million in new U.S. humanitarian assistance for Sudan, but said hardly any aid was reaching isolated populations. Both sides have been accused of using control over food access as a weapon. Now, Maureen, the beginning of that report started with talking about this sort of clash between weapons aid and humanitarian aid. Which do you think should be prioritized? Both obviously have their credit, I think, with weapons aid potentially ending a conflict sooner, but humanitarian aid obviously benefiting and preserving lives. Which do you think is more important in a conflict like this?
Well, clearly, humanitarian aid. I mean, in Sudan, this is an internal warfare between two rival military groups, is my understanding, and the population are being displaced not just internally within Sudan, but to other countries round about it, Chad, for example. But those still within the country's borders are facing huge famine, a bit like those in Gaza. And it, we rely so much on our third sector organizations to help in these situations, and Sudan is not getting the profile that Gaza is, for example. So resources are not forthcoming, but there are huge problems of malnutrition in Sudan. And as I say, it isn't a conflict between two different countries. It is an internal fight between two leaders with, factions, obviously, but just huge egos and with absolutely no concern whatsoever for their populations. It's absolutely crazy in this day and age.
Thank you, Maureen. For our last stories, we have beavers create habitats suitable for water voles in Scottish rainforest. Beavers reintroduced to forest in Knapdale in Argyll and Bute 15 years ago may have created the right habitat for the area's endangered water voles to flourish. Voles were once abundant in Scotland, but are now one of the country's most threatened native animals. It is thought that voles could thrive in the boundary between water and land that beavers have created in the Knapdale forest since their reintroduction there in 2009. Sorry. The Beaver's Dam building in the forest has led to the creation of a new habitat along the banks of watercourses, where water voles can dig burrows hidden from predatory mink. John Taylor, the West Region Area Wildlife Manager for Forestry and Land Scotland, FLS, which manages the Knapdale Forest, said, aside from flooding a few places, the biggest impact we've seen from the beavers is creating a new habitat along water courses. They've increased what we call edge habitat. Instead of a harsh change from water to land, the edges along the burns and locks are softened and seasonally flooded. This more complex boundary between water and land could be excellent for water voles, he said. Maureen, what do you think of these habitat preservation efforts?
Well, this is a good news story, and I remember the huge outcry that Mike Russell, who was the MSP for Argyll and Bute, had about the reintroduction of beavers, and it was good that at that point that it was confined to Argyll, and clearly, we sometimes forget about the number of species and um, flora and fauna that are under threat and are facing extinction. And if the result of reintroducing beavers has also meant that there has been a reintroduction or a halt in the decline of water voles, that is really important because all of these species contribute to enhancing our overall habitat.
Yeah, absolutely, Maureen. And it's always interesting to see the interplay between how like these different animals and species can benefit and aid each other in that sort of ecosystem. Well,
Yeah.
that does wrap us up for this evening. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programs will always be free to view. However, if you can afford the £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make regular monthly payments, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. Thanks again to the friend of the show, Maureen Watt. Thanks for joining me. You're lovely.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And goodbye. Thank you for watching.